autonomy, you have to have some idea of being a strategic actor. And my question to you would be very blunt and very direct. Is the EU a strategic actor?
Well, Spiros, I mean, I would say to that question that, I mean, obviously the EU is not and cannot be a strategic actor in the way in which a state is strategic. So it's very clear that what strategy means for an entity like the European Union is different from what strategy means for a state. And I remember sort of actually thinking quite a lot about this question when I was working on the global strategy. I mean, one of the first conversations that I had was with the penholder of the 2015 US security strategy. So this was kind of Obama administration, and it became, I mean, he gave me lots of really good tips in terms of how to do it, but it became really obvious to me that, you know, whereas for a state, what you're essentially doing is, yes, setting out your objectives of a strategic nature, you outline what your means are, and you have a sense that with the deployment of those means, you can actually achieve those objectives. When it comes to the European Union, those means are, you know, they are sort of part and then therefore mobilized by a collective on which you don't really have full control. And so in a sense, it's more aspirational. I mean, I think that being strategic for an entity like the European Union has more to do with the building of its own identity rather than being strategic in the more traditional, in a sense of the term. But in that more, in a sense, identity building sense of strategy and what strategy, you know, the role that strategy plays in defining who you are, I think that it does play a role in European foreign policy, but as I said, in a process sense, rather than a more static way in which one would sort of, ascribe to a state. But I think it's simply reflective of the animal that we're talking about.
If I could just pick you up on that, because you mentioned the differentiation between objectives and means, and how the process of defining what Europe's strategic activeness may mean is a process of identifying what Europe might mean. So what does this say about the objectives? Because I understand the means-driven argument about trying to find a common way of achieving things. And perhaps we'll come back to PESCO later on as something which fits in here very well. But the objectives, are the objectives clearly defined, cohesive enough to be able to say, we're moving in a specific direction, or even as a group of 27, we know that this is the way forward and this is what our strategic objectives could be, which will mean that, you know, we do have an idea of what strategy is. I mean, the reason why I say this is because, you know, one of the things that the European global, I'm a great fan of the European global strategy. And I'm not saying this just because you're here, but I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about it, writing about it, and defending it to a certain extent. And one of the things that I think was a sort of shift in terms of thinking about foreign security policy was this one phrase which has been much abused, but it's the thing about pragmatism.
Principle pragmatism. I love it. I mean, it's my baby. I mean,
that's your baby, right? That's your baby. But that was an attempt, I think, to create something of an objective which was different and new. Yeah. And I was just wondering to what extent this has remained in any sense useful as a way of identifying what it is that the EU does in its foreign security policy.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to me, principle pragmatism, perhaps even at a higher level than an objective, was really trying to convey the philosophy, in a sense, behind the strategy, the ethos behind the strategy, and it was trying to sort of capture a moment, and I think it's a moment that we are still in, which basically sort of said, well, the way in which Europeans and the European Union had understood them, sort of their role in the world, which sort of in shorthand was, if you like, the sort of the normative power. I mean, that historical phase which was kind of deeply embedded in the international liberal order, and therefore it was premised on a particular configuration of power, and kind of the EU was part of that picture. It deployed soft power, civilian power. I mean, we know that story. Now that world was kind of obviously fading away, and it is fading away. It has faded away. So, you know, there was this impulse of basic, which I think to an extent is still there, and very prominent in some of the language being used. You know, we now have to be, you know, this is a multipolar world. We have to be geopolitical. So, by the way, that's a word that kind of makes my hair kind of, you know, sort of stand straight. But this general sense of the world as a nasty place, which obviously to an extent reflects a reality and reflects a degree of, I wouldn't say necessarily, I mean, the point, I guess, let me put it this way. What I think was important was to avoid that becoming more realistic about the world translated in becoming more realist. And to me, the idea of pragmatism captured the wanting to be more realistic. I mean, not having these rose-tinted lenses to observe the world, but at the same time recognizing that the European Union is the European Union. I mean, it is not something else, and it is not going to be an actor. I mean, coming back to the point that I was making earlier, it's not going to be the United States, and it's not going to be China, and it's not going to be Russia. Because it is a different, you know, it is a different kind of animal. And so principal pragmatism really tried to sort of convey the sense of, yes, we need to have a pragmatic sort of view of the context of the world. And of course, we need to approach it by being true to our own principles, and perhaps actually making sure that the first thing that we do is actually living up to our own principles internally. So before we even start preaching to the rest of the world, which is in a sense very much part of that old normative power Europe, in a sense, philosophy, making sure that we actually live up to our own rule of law, for instance, internally. So it was trying to sort of convey that notion.
I have a couple of questions. I really do invite the students to ask their questions as soon as possible, but let me just follow up with a couple of questions. As the European Union global strategy, as you said, was an attempt in your view to create something rather new in terms of a changing international order, but not to go whole hog geopolitics, realpolitik, et cetera, even though the language of the Commission and some of the actions that have taken place since, well, especially in the last 2 years, has shown that geopolitics is increasingly important, and that, you know, realpolitik has taken on board a lot of the lessons learned from the past. But my question is comes in the form of a criticism which was aired about the European global strategy very recently by Sven Biskop, in which he said, you know, the EUGS is no longer relevant, that it served a purpose at a particular moment in time, but now we've moved beyond that. What do you make of that?
Okay, let me put it this way. When the current High Representative asked me to stay on as special advisor, the first conversation that we had was, okay, you know, I mean, the question is, what does a special advisor do? I mean, you know, once you decide you want a special advisor, you have to figure out what they do. And Josep said to me, well, I mean, do you think that we should be working on a new strategy? And to be honest, against my own interests, because people like me write papers. Yeah, you know, I kind of write, I don't do that much. And I said to him that I thought that it was a terrible idea. I think that it's exactly what we should not be doing now. So I have been very critical. Now we're in a sort of closed group here, so I wouldn't say this publicly, but I have been very critical, for instance, of the process on the strategic compass, and I tell you why. I mean, you know, a strategy is not supposed to be a description of reality. It's supposed to convey a general philosophy, concept, and a general sense of direction. So if I think about the global, I mean, of course, lots of things change by definition, but have the things that have changed between 2016 and today tell us that if we kind of really, get boiled down to, what does the strategy say that we should be doing? That we should be concentrating less on security and defense? Well, no, I don't think that anything that has happened suggests that. That resilience has become less of an important notion? Well, no, in fact, it's become such an important notion that we now talk about it when we talk about ourselves, not just when we talk about our neighbors. Having an integrated approach to conflicts and crises is less important because these conflicts and crises have been resolved. Well, no, actually, a lot more has exploded in our faces, from Nagorno-Karabakh to Eastern Mediterranean, and none of the old conflicts have been solved. The regional cooperation or multilateralism are less important. Well, obviously, no, they are far more important now than they were 5 years ago. So, of course, one can always write another paper. But I feel extremely uncomfortable with a union that simply talks and produces paper and uses paper production as a substitute for action. So, what I've been saying to the High Representative, and in fact, anywhere I go, as I said, against my own sort of selfish interests, is that this is the moment to do stuff. This is not the moment to talk or to write. And as I said, I think it becomes terrible. I mean, we just look ridiculous as Europeans if, you have a strategy, then you have an implementation plan, then you have a civilian compact, then you have PESCO, then you have now a strategic compass. And what have we done between 2016 and today? We have seen this increasing sort of an implicit partnership, for instance, between Russia and Turkey, although they are on often at times diametrically opposite positions. Why do they end up working with one another? Well, lots of reasons, I mean, obviously their leaders get on and whatever, but also because they both act. And yes, they act in their interest. That's what normally actors do, unless they're completely irrational, yeah? And the only reason that they are able to do it is that we are completely united in our passivity. And this is what angers me the most. So to answer your question, yes, it's all, you can always make the point that you can write another paper. But is this really the priority?
Okay, before we get on, there's some questions coming in. Before we get on to the issue of strategic autonomy itself, because that is what the headline topic is for this talk, this meeting. You mentioned interests, and you mentioned Russia and Turkey and interests. And we have a question from Simon, which essentially asks, what are European interests? If action is going to be built on interest, what is a European interest as such? The example that Simon puts in the chat is a comparison between France and Germany, where Germany may have interests which focus on security interests, which focus on climate change, pandemic readiness, while France has interests which focus on the Sahel or sub-Saharan Africa. Germany has energy interests to do with Nord Stream. Other countries have China on their mind. So just to sort of go back to the point that you were making, what is a European interest? What is a European interest upon which a security agenda can be built, let alone a strategy? We'll come back to the strategy in a second.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that on a very at a very high level, we can surely, and this is why, I really insisted with the global strategy that it started off with a definition of interests. Now, in a very, very general sense, we have an interest in the security of our citizens. We have an interest in economic prosperity. We have an interest in democratic resilience, etc. Now, but then when it sort of, you kind of go a level down and you say, well, okay, you obviously, we have different objectives as member states, true. Now, and certainly, not only do we often have different objectives, but we have different strategic cultures in how to approach these. And so, as to the question, does that necessarily impede a European strategy? I would say, well, No, not necessarily. I mean, of course, you know, yes, to the extent that those objectives are mutually contrasting and, or rather, mutually exclusive. And that the extent to which they're mutually exclusive trumps the degree of convergence that there may be on other issues. So, say, for example, something that has been, I find maddening, you know, to give a concrete example, Libya. Yeah, so Italy and France have obviously different objectives, contrasting objectives when it comes to Libya. But what I find so infuriating is that I say, well, are your contrasting objectives, do they weigh more than the joint interest that you have in not having this conflict being determined by Russia, Turkey, UAE, and Egypt? So surely Italy and France, you must agree that what is happening is in neither of your interests. And is it really so difficult to make that step? Which is why I think that whereas it is true that, of course, you know, member states have different interests and objectives and what have you, to me, the often hidden problem is not the contrasting the different interests of member states. It is rather, and this is why I hinted at this earlier, it is rather the fact that they're united in their passivity. They agree on not doing anything. And it is because they have been used to living in a world in which the something was done by someone else. Now, the someone else was, and this takes us to transatlantic relations, the someone else was the United States. And now we're, I think, living through this period of sort of disorientation when the ones that we expected to act don't act, and others start acting, but we're still in this kind of phase where, you know, we are sort of cognitive dissonance in which we can't quite make the leap of saying, right, it's no longer the ones that we thought would act, someone else. We don't like what they do, but we're still in this psychological mindset of passivity because it belonged to a different era.
Okay, since you brought up this question of a transatlantic relationship, this is my way in to ask you about what strategic autonomy actually means, right? Because I don't think there's any clear agreement here, either amongst member states or amongst people like yourself or me or our students as to actually exactly what it means. I think we all have a consensus as what autonomy, autonomy from whom. I think people would immediately say, well, it's the United States of America. That's the autonomy from whom. But autonomy to do what? That's the real question. What does this strategic autonomy mean? Does Emmanuel Macron have the same image of strategic autonomy as does the Prime Minister of Greece or Portugal or Finland or Denmark? And this is something which I think is the key. It's good to talk about strategy, but we've also said that, well, there may not be common interests. It's good to talk about Europe as a strategic actor, but we don't know what it's acting on. Strategy is a philosophy. So what is the strategic autonomy about? What does it actually mean? Do you think it means anything? Your microphone, Nathalie.
Sorry. So I kind of start with the meaning of the word and the etymology of the word. So it's auto and it's nomos. So it's the self. Okay, fine. That's us, the European Union, and it's law. So in a sense, I think, and this is the reason why I'm very fond of the word autonomy as applied to the European Union, far more than the word sovereignty, which is often used interchangeably with autonomy. I think that sovereignty does not convey what we're trying to do. I think autonomy does, and I think in a way which is very reflective of what the European Union is. So I think it is our ability to live by our laws, and our laws, our rules, our norms, however you want to put it. They're obviously domestic, they're European, they're international, which I think connects back to this idea of the EU having an existential interest in a rules-based international order. So it's not just internal, it's also international. So, put this way, it's so obvious, yeah, that, why on earth are we only talking about it now? And then why is it controversial? So I think as to, why are we talking about it now as opposed to the past? I think this is very much the product that, not only obviously an internal development of the Union, so that makes it a possibility, But what makes it a necessity is that we are no longer living in an international system where the protection and the promotion of those laws, norms, rules, whatever, was in a sense kind of not guaranteed, but was favored or promoted by the system. Because that system, I mean, again, you know, this is the international liberal order. This is where we were embedded. We didn't even have to ask ourselves the question because we were a component of a broader system. It was all in a sense, quote unquote, in harmony. I mean, first, obviously, limited to the free world during the Cold War, and then extended beyond it. And that was the order in which we operated. Now we no longer operate in that order, and hey, we're realizing that there are some actors that actually kind of want us to violate our own rules and norms and laws. Sometimes those actors are even our best friends. I mean, you know, this is why I think, whereas the term strategic autonomy was kind of, you know, mentioned 20 billion times in the global strategy, it then sort of gained the momentum that it did over the Trump administration, because it was our best friend that was forcing us to violate our own laws, JCPOA, extraterritorial sanctions, etc. But then it wasn't just the United States, of course. You know, we started, I mean, obviously there is the kind of quote unquote old story about Russia, energy security. I mean, now we don't talk about it as much in these terms. But there was the way in which, for instance, through disinformation, again, there was this kind of, you know, sort of driving a sort of wedge in the heart of our democratic systems. And then, of course, there has been, and this has been slightly more recent, our gradual opening up to the fact that, you know, the kind of actor China is. So, you know, for a while, we have been obviously sort of knowing that what China is doing in East Asia is not exactly kind of, you know, great, but hey, we don't really have a dog in that fight. And we used to think that what China did westwards was relatively benign. And I think it's been only over the last, I would say, you know, to be generous, 3 years, 4 years maybe max, that there's been this gradual awakening as to the strategic intent of what China was doing westwards through the Belt and Road. And again, the way in which that also could harm our own norms, rules, and practices. So I think, you know, the reason why autonomy became important now is essentially this. I think the reason why there is a controversy about it is what I consider to be the phony argument. And the phony argument is the sort of the transatlantic sort of criticism. And I think it's a phony argument. And the only reason why it's a controversy is that we just talk about it and we don't do autonomy. Because the controversy is in the application of strategic autonomy basically exclusively to security and defense. And there the argument is, well, you know, is this, you know, does this basically contrast with strengthening the transatlantic relationship, which is why the whole controversy then kind of rose to new heights after the spat between French President Macron and German Defense Minister. When was it? Last November or December? I can't recall. Basically, just after the Biden victory. So, you know, now is the time to strengthen the transatlantic relationship. Surely what we do not do, and certainly what, if it's the French doing it, I mean, God forbid, you don't kind of poke two fingers in the eyes of the US administration. And I personally think that that is the wrong criticism. I think, and I'll come to it, I think there are two right potential criticisms and therefore risks to strategic autonomy. I think that's the wrong argument. And I think it is because if one actually were to do more on security and defense as Europeans, and therefore take greater responsibility, take greater risk. I mean, you know, I mentioned some of the conflicts in our surrounding regions where I do think that we should be doing a lot more. Well, that would be an exercise, in a sense, of strategic autonomy with all its limitations that, yes, we'll probably continue to see an asymmetric relationship with the United States, that would actually favor a strengthened transatlantic relationship. It would not harm it. And the only reason why this is controversial is because it's an ideological debate, and it's an ideological debate because nothing happens in practice. Now, and just to conclude on this, I do think that there are two risks when it comes to strategic autonomy, which are important risks to think about and therefore to mitigate against. And they have less to do with security policy and more to do with autonomy when interpreted in a sense in more industrial terms, more in areas, whether it's digital, whether it's energy, whether it's defense itself, but in industrial terms. And I think those two risks one should be far more cognizant of. Risk number one is an internal concentration of power in the hands of a few, i.e. of the strong, i.e. of the same old member states, i.e. France and Germany, often at times. One only needs to think about the, it was blocked, yeah, but there's sort of the Alstom Siemens story. So good arguments to do it. We want to have European champions in order to compete in the global marketplace, but there are risks involved, which, I don't argue, therefore, that it shouldn't be done, but I think that we should be aware of those risks while we do it. Risk number two is external protectionism. So you want to exercise your autonomy, you sign a comprehensive agreement on investment with China. Fantastic, very well, and you do it because you want to level the playing field. What happens, though, if in the implementation of the comprehensive agreement, China does not quite, it kind of, the sort of, state subsidies and, everything that China does continues as it is, and you still rightly want to level the playing field. What does that mean? If you can't level the playing field up towards, if you like, greater liberalization, does that mean that you level it down? And therefore, you have to end up being more protectionist as a result. Again, I'm not arguing what should or should not be done. I'm just saying that I think those are two fair criticisms of where autonomy can take one that one should be cognizant of.
Okay, I've got loads of questions I can ask you, but there's also loads of questions coming in from the other members of the group. So let me just try and paraphrase them and try and group them together if I can. One of the questions asks about strategic partnerships. It asks very specifically about Turkey and the relationship with Turkey and how, if I can paraphrase it in a sense, the European Union is in a strategic partnership with a country which for many in the European Union is highly problematic, both in terms of domestic political arrangements and also recent actions in the Eastern Mediterranean, which affect the interests and values of EU member states and international law and so on and so forth. So what's the justification in a sense then for having a form of relationship with Turkey which doesn't really necessarily fit in with certain values? And a second half of that question is by Alexander Zachariadis, who asks, in relation to the EU laws and values, which you said are so important in this idea of autonomy, from your definition, how can we talk about autonomy in strategic terms or foreign policy terms when we have such a range of internal problems to do with illiberal democracy, backsliding, populism? The current examples of Poland and Hungary, but we had a populist government in Greece. There are forms of populism which result in Brexit. We've seen the rise of populist parties elsewhere. So the question is about autonomy, laws and values, and how then this affects, what do strategic partnerships then mean? And then also, how can we talk about the external environment when our own internal environment is so much more complex?
Yeah, well, fantastic questions. Okay, so on the Turkey question, and in a sense, one could also apply it to Russia. It would be even harder to apply this.
Well, indeed. I think the whole question of strategic partnerships doesn't necessarily fit in very neatly with the idea of, the legal value-based idea of autonomy.
Well, yes, very realistic. Though. I do know. So let's take Turkey. So, here you are with a country which internally, in terms of its democratic standards, has been going down the drain. And on the other hand, it is where it is, and it is and will always be important to the to Europeans, to the European Union, whether you look at it in terms of the economy, in terms of security, in terms of migration, in terms of energy. I mean, you know, look at it left, right, and center. You need to have a relationship with this country. Okay, so what do you do? I think personally, and this goes back to the rules issue, that what we've been doing has been shooting ourselves in the foot. And I think that this is what's been happening, I mean, for the best part of the last decade and a half, to be honest, but even more acutely, I think, over the last 5 years. Because essentially what we've done is we have bracketed out the element, the component of the relationship, which is rules-based, and we have then inevitably had to continue interacting because of all those interdependencies that I was mentioning earlier, in a way which has basically given, in Italian you say, you know, tieni il coltello dalla parte del manico, yeah, you hold the knife from the handle to Turkey. Because essentially, if you lower the relationship to a purely transactional set of interactions, and of course the 2016 EU-Turkey statement on migration really epitomizes this, and you completely exclude any form of rules-based engagement, then this is what you end up with. Now, one could say, well, Nathalie, I mean, where do you live? I mean, don't you know that the accession process is kind of dead in the water? Yes, I do know that. What I don't understand is why we have not taken, you know, sort of called the bluff, basically, on the modernized customs union. And when I say call the bluff, what I mean is that I don't personally think that Erdogan's Turkey would actually be willing to change the nitty-gritty of its, you know, political economy in the way in which a modernized customs union would require. But it's absurd that we were the ones saying no, you know, assuming that doing so would be a present to Erdogan rather than a present to ourselves and to Turkey Inc., if you like, you know, for the Turkey that does want to move in a different direction. So, you know, I think to answer the question, you know, in a situation in which you're dealing with countries where interdependencies are there and will remain, what you should be doing if you want to exercise your autonomy, but do it in a principled and pragmatic way, is look for a terrain where not only you have, in a sense, stronger cards to play, but those cards, and I think the two things go hand in hand, those cards are inherently rules-based. And I don't think that we've been doing it with Turkey. Probably more difficult to do it with Russia, but again, we haven't even tried to do it with Russia either. And as to the internal question, I mean, to me, this is the starting point. You know, I mean, I think autonomy is an aspiration. I think it's an agenda, if you like. I don't think it's obviously a reality, nor do I think it's a short-term objective. But if you want to pursue that agenda, not only would I say that strategic autonomy starts at home, but strategic autonomy starts with strengthening your own democratic resilience. And so I think that the whole issue of rule of law is key. And I connect this back to the point that I was making earlier about, you know, if, you know, if, for instance, the EU-Turkey statement is an instance of, I mean, it's a sort of diametric opposite of what strategic autonomy should be about. The reason why we ended up in that place is precisely because of internal weaknesses in our own rules and values. You know, we wouldn't have handed, if you like, I'm not sure I'm expressing this as well, we wouldn't have handed over so much power to Turkey if it wasn't that we were, and that we have been, wavering on our own democratic standards when it comes to asylum and migration policy, for instance, internally. So I think they're two sides of the same coin.
Okay, there's a number of questions that have come in, and this is something which I think we wanted to talk about anyway, about the defense security dimension of strategic autonomy, because in this sort of narrative of strategic autonomy, is woven in very much the question of capabilities, of operationalizing strategic autonomy. Where does PESCO fit in? Where should we do things on our own and in a different context from the transatlantic relationships, etc.? What I sense from you is that the defense and security component shouldn't be overemphasized. And yet a lot of what is happening and what is being discussed is very much in the defense sphere. What's your take on that? What's your opinion on that? Your microphone, Nathalie.
I keep on doing this for some reason. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there was a moment in which there was a sort of, so the global strategy came out, Trump, Brexit, so referendum happened, Trump got elected president of the United States, and this triggered this set of initiatives from the military planning and conduct capability to PESCO, etc., etc. And I was, and I am, of course, all in favor of this. And it was really about, building the mechanisms, the instruments, the institutions to do things. And, okay, fine, it was obviously necessary to do this. But I think that now we're in a different place. And I come back to my objection, for instance, to the strategic compass. We've now launched these initiatives. We have a European Defence Fund. We have PESCO. I mean, these are long-term projects. Yeah. So, we cannot judge the success of PESCO or the European Defence Fund in 2021. We can start judging it maybe from 2025 onwards. I mean, it takes a long time to build these capabilities. But my main problem when it comes to the security and defence piece is not with those instruments and initiatives. It's rather with the fact that if you look at the kind of cases that we have around us, is it the case that, again, I take the Libya example, but one could take Nagorno-Karabakh, you could take Ukraine, Belarus, you take your pick, there's plenty. Do we not have the capabilities? We're not talking about, doing a 2011 type military intervention in Libya where indeed we don't really have the capabilities. We're not there. The kind of things that we should be doing, we have the capabilities for. What we don't have is the, sorry the expression, the guts to do it, because it does entail taking risks. If you send a peacekeeping or a peacekeeping monitoring mission to Libya in a situation where obviously the insecurity continues to be, fairly prominent, there is a risk of body bags coming home. It's just the way it is. But it's not a problem of capabilities, it's a problem of strategic culture. And the only reason why we don't have that strategic culture is because we've been used to others doing this for us. And then, I come back to this phase of cognitive dissonance that we're in.
Which brings me to the sort of continuation of this question and this is, get your crystal ball out and tell us what you think is possibly likely going to happen in the sort of transatlantic relationship. Because on the one hand, you have a new administration, which we all assume is going to be more pro-transatlantic, pro-European by comparison to the previous administration, which is not a difficult thing to achieve. But a lot of this, I think, the differences that existed in the last 4 years were rhetorical differences rather than practical differences. So what do you think the language of strategic autonomy is? How is it going to affect the relationship with an administration which is likely to be more pro-transatlantic, pro-European?
Yes, I agree with you. I think that I would put it this way. I think the reason why the last 4 years had been so traumatic was not because of policy differences. It was because basically for the first time in the course of our history as a European Union, we were considered as enemies by the president of the White House. And this was really quite traumatic. I think policy difference-wise, there have been more, far more acute moments. If we just think back at, first Bush administration, for instance, just to name one. So, I think what will change over the next, has already changed and will continue to change, it is indeed this idea of, we're now back as part of the same family. Fantastic, great, and I think there is going to be a real investment in relationships, and of course those matter. Now, what I think will, a couple of things which I think will not change. I don't think that we will now see the United States stepping back and engaging in a sort of very meaningful way in our part of the world. Not out of lack of will, but simply out of, sort of lack of capabilities, to use that term. I mean, its priorities are elsewhere and its capabilities are finite. And again, it's a different historical moment. So I think what we will see is far greater willingness to coordinate with us, but an expectation that we should be doing the heavy lifting in our part of the world. And I think that the main element of frustration that there will be in the transatlantic relationship is when the Americans will see that this is not happening. So to me, Americans will be more frustrated with us as we continue talking about strategic autonomy and not doing it, rather than us actually, doing it, for which I think they would be mainly rather, sort of happy to see this happening. Now, yes, at times there may be instances in which they don't particularly like what we do. So they didn't like the fact that the EU signed a comprehensive agreement on investment with China. But okay, they were a bit annoyed, but frankly speaking, it wasn't the end of the world. So I think, we can get it, for good and ill, we can get it right or wrong. I'm not a big fan of the comprehensive agreement of investment in China, although I do read it through the lens of autonomy. But I don't think that these will be the areas which are really going to trigger disagreement across the Atlantic. I think there's going to be more frustration, as I said, as Americans watch us kind of, swim around in our passivity.
But doesn't the sort of idea of strategic autonomy, I mean, let me put it to you differently. We've been through iterations of this in the past where, for example, in the 1970s and 1980s, there was this sort of growing call for a European security and defense identity, which did emerge, but it didn't really fruitfully become anything in practice. We've talked about a European pillar to transatlanticism for a generation now, and nothing really came of this. Is strategic autonomy just a new version of this? Do the Americans see us and go, well, what we'd really like to see is a division of labor, where we can go and do the things we want to do in the South, in the South China Sea, which strategically for us is much more important, and allow the Europeans, with our blessing, as it were, to deal with the Eastern Mediterranean, for example. And we've seen recently in the last 8 months, a situation developing in the Eastern Mediterranean, which the European Union, for pragmatic reasons, hasn't been able to cope with and deal with. And ultimately, the United States of America has stepped in and has tried to push the parties together to sit down and start talking, etc. So, if I'm sitting in Washington, however friendly I am to the transatlantic idea, I'm listening to these demands for strategic autonomy and wish for a division of labor from a European Union that's talking about the geopolitical context of the South and the East. And yet when it comes to it, these guys don't do anything. So where did this go? Where does this go?
Well, exactly. This is exactly my point. So, once upon a time, the United States was kind of suspicious. If we go back to those previous attempts, the United States was kind of suspicious, cautious, critical a bit, because it had the sense that if we did it, it would harm the transatlantic relationship. I don't think this is where they are. I think now they get annoyed with us when we don't do it, rather than when we, and they get even more annoyed with us when we talk about it and we don't do it. Now, to sort of say perhaps something mildly more positive, I do think that if we set aside security and defense and actually look at some of the other areas where I think autonomy is an important concept, there I think that we have a sort of, and we do have a fairer chance of actually doing something. I mean, I find it sort of fascinating to, for instance, read initiatives like the carbon border adjustment tax through the lens of autonomy. To read, the hydrogen strategy, the battery strategy, the battery alliance or the hydrogen alliance through the lens of strategic autonomy. Looking at, if, for instance, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act are going to lead to a more integrated digital market, the extent to which that may then spur movement in terms of autonomy in the digital sphere. I think there we're probably sort of slightly more behind than on energy and climate. So I think on these more industrial elements of autonomy, I'm more optimistic. On security policy, I mean, I'm in a fairly desperate phase,
Okay, well, join me in my desperate phase. There are a number of questions which are coming in with respect to Brexit, and I think since we are a British academic institution, some of us are actually located in the UK right now as I speak, others are not. I think it's important for us to just have a quick conversation with you about Brexit. Now, one of the questions is very specific to the, if you want, defense capability implications of Brexit, and the other is more broadly speaking to do with the relationship between Britain as a veto player in future defense integration in Europe. Let me just broaden it out and ask you, the United Kingdom has left the European Union. The United Kingdom, I think we'd all agree, is a like-minded state and shares the same kind of general objectives as the EU 27. Should we be positive about the possibility that an arrangement can be reached through negotiation where the UK is not seen as a rule taker, but can opt into policies and operations, PESCO and initiatives, where and where it sees fit, with the sort of agreement of all EU 27? Or are we in a situation where, Whitehall says we're not rule takers, Brussels says we don't want these people involved in our decision-making process because they're a negative influence, and the two shall never meet?
Well, speakers, I mean, I think that whereas obviously I think like probably everyone in this call, I think that Brexit was an absolute disaster. But if one is to sort of bracket out security and defense, I actually think that potentially a post-Brexit sort of agreement with the EU on security and defense may actually be even better than having the UK in. So I don't think it in general, obviously, but I do think it in this respect, because as I think was implicit in one question, it excludes, it kind of, sort of solves the problem that, of course, we had, particularly in the sort of Cameron years onwards, which was, basically the United Kingdom acting as a brake on any initiative, any defense initiative, without necessarily while at the same time reaping the benefits that cooperation with the United Kingdom entails, given not only the fact that we share the same goals, interests, identity, all good things, but also capabilities. So it's really the best of both worlds, I think, for both. Now, this is in a world of kind of rationality, and maybe we're going to get to it at some point. I hoped that after the agreement was reached last December, that of course, a more rational world would have been completely off the cards had there not been an agreement. I was more optimistic in December than I am today about the speed to which rationality would return. I don't see much rationality kind of in the relationship in over the last sort of 2.5 months or so, which I think is unfortunate, because so long as that general climate is irrational in the way in which it is, it will prevent us reaping the potential from what is very obviously a mutually beneficial relationship when it comes to security and defense.
Okay, we are running out of time, and thank you very much for your time, Nathalie. There are loads more questions that we have to ask, but I personally would like to say thank you for joining us today, and good to see you again. and for your insights into a variety of issues which all our students are engaged with in one way or another. If I can just sort of underline two of the things you said, which people may not really think about, is that to a great extent you see strategic autonomy as something which is quite inward looking in a sense, which is to do with defining what Europe is, this identity building side of it, process of it, which I suppose is not too different from what Robert Cooper would have said in 2003 about the European security strategy, or what you said about the global strategy and Federica Mogherini said about the global strategy when you actually authored that. So that's something which I think people ought to think about. And the second element, which I'm not entirely in agreement with you about, but it's the idea that strategic autonomy is not just, or shouldn't be focused entirely on the security and defense dimension, which, you know, I think people tend to forget about. There are other aspects of strategic autonomy which are equally or if not more important. I think maybe the language of strategic autonomy then is wrong, and this gives this the wrong kind of signal. But anyway, thank you very, very much. I know the organizers would like to say a thank you on the behalf of the society. So from me, thank you very much. And I'll hand you back over to Aida.
Yeah, thank you so much to you both for such an insightful conversation and dedicating an hour of your precious time to us. We're very grateful for it. Also, special thanks to everyone attending, because I know it's a very busy time of the term, so it's very difficult to manage. Thank you so much. We will keep you updated on the upcoming events. We will have officials from the Commission, the other special advisor to Josep Borrell, Federico Steinberg, and we're also going to have Federica Mogherini at the end of the month. So we'll keep you posted on that. For now, have a fantastic evening, everyone, and see you very soon.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Thank you, Spiros. Thanks you, Aida. It's wonderful to be back home at LSE.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.